We eat more food today than any civilization in recorded history, and somehow we've narrowed our actual diet down to roughly a dozen plants. A medieval peasant working a half-acre plot with hand tools had more genuine variety on their dinner table than most people push around a supermarket trolley today. That's not romantic exaggeration, that's just arithmetic. So what happened to the rest? The answer isn't one thing. Sometimes it was a faster crop, sometimes a shinier competitor from another continent, sometimes a herbicide, and occasionally, just occasionally, an entire vegetable vanished because it was inconvenient for an industry that needed things to stack neatly in a box. 15 of those vegetables are in this video. Some disappeared quietly, some were actively replaced. A few are still growing wild right now, in ditches, on clifftops, in the cracks of your garden beds, completely ignored while we pay a premium for produce that tastes like it's given up. Medieval food was genuinely difficult, often dangerous, and unpleasant in ways we shouldn't romanticize, but these plants were good. They fed people reliably for centuries, and the reasons they're gone tell us more about modern food systems than any documentary about supermarkets. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. Let's get into it.
Before the potato arrived in Europe, there was skirret, and for about 1,000 years it did the potato's job without demanding nearly as much attention. Skirret is a root vegetable. Clusters of thin, pale roots, naturally sweet, sweeter than carrots, sweeter than parsnips, with a flavor that medieval cooks described as somewhere between the two. It appeared in royal kitchen accounts going back to the 14th century. It wasn't just peasant food. It earned a place in palace gardens, specifically because people with options kept choosing it. What made it genuinely useful was its temperament. Plant it once and it multiplied underground on its own schedule without demanding much from the farmer beyond occasionally remembering it existed. In an era where crop failure meant starvation, a vegetable with that kind of quiet self-sufficiency wasn't just convenient, it was security. Medieval cooks roasted it, boiled it, incorporated it into stews, and made what old recipe manuscripts describe as sweet pies, essentially an early root vegetable pastry that sounds considerably more appealing than it might appear on parchment. Skirret's decline is not a mystery. The potato arrived from South America in the late 16th century, and the potato was bigger, starchier, and could feed more people per acre. Skirret didn't fail any test. It simply got out-muscled by a carbohydrate from another continent. There's a version of that story that applies to most industries. Skirret just got there first. It can still be grown. Seeds are available from specialist suppliers. Whether it deserves a comeback is genuinely a matter of taste, but it's worth knowing it was here at all. Nobody knows where the name comes from. There are theories, a connection to the German Guter Heinrich, a folk reference to helpful spirits in Germanic plant lore, but nothing confirmed. The name is a minor mystery attached to a plant that was otherwise completely unremarkable in the best possible way. Good King Henry was everywhere in medieval Europe. It grew wild and in gardens simultaneously, required no replanting once established, and came back each year without being asked. For a medieval farmer managing land with limited labor, a perennial food crop wasn't a bonus feature, it was the whole point. The nutritional case is strong. Its iron content exceeds spinach. It carries significant levels of vitamin C, and unlike many plants that offer one thing at one time, Good King Henry was harvestable in 3 distinct ways across its growing season. Young shoots in spring, treated like asparagus, mature leaves through summer, used like spinach, flower buds in early autumn, eaten like miniature broccoli. 3 vegetables, 1 plant, no replanting. Its disappearance is less a story of defeat than of structural incompatibility. Commercial farming needs crops that can be planted, grown, harvested, and cleared within a single season. Perennials don't fit that model, not because they're inferior, but because an industry built on the annual cycle of tillage and replanting has no mechanism for something that simply stays in the ground and keeps going. Good King Henry was too self-sufficient for a system that profits from starting over every year. Fat hen was never cultivated, it simply arrived. This wild green, low-growing with small pale leaves and unremarkable flowers, colonized fields, garden edges, and disturbed ground across northern Europe with complete indifference to whether it was wanted. Medieval farmers didn't plant it, they found it there, and being pragmatic people who ate what was available, they ate it. Archaeological evidence from food waste pits across multiple northern European sites confirms fat hen was a regular part of the diet well before the medieval period and continued to be through it. During famines, which were not occasional but recurring features of medieval life, fat hen was often the difference between adequate nutrition and none. Its protein content exceeds cabbage, its iron exceeds spinach, its calcium exceeds kale. Every one of those comparisons is documented. The name comes from its effectiveness as poultry feed. Chickens that ate it laid better and grew plumper, the implication being that what was considered good enough for the chickens turned out to be quietly excellent for everyone else. Fat hen's disappearance from the human diet is not a story of something better coming along. It's a story of herbicide development in the 20th century. The same chemicals that protect wheat crops from competition kill fat hen with no distinction. We didn't stop eating it because we found a superior option. We chemically removed it from our fields and called that agricultural progress. It's still there. Stop pulling it in your garden for a few weeks and it will prove the point. Welsh onions are neither Welsh nor technically onions, a combination of inaccuracies that somehow perfectly encapsulates their history. The name comes from Welsh, the old German word for foreign. They originated in East Asia, most likely China, and reached Europe via trade routes sometime around the 12th or 13th century. Medieval farmers adopted them quickly, not because they were exotic, but because they were relentlessly practical. The key feature, they're perennial. One planted clump divides and multiplies year after year, providing a continuous supply of fresh green shoots through all but the harshest winters. In regions where fresh greens disappeared from November through April, Welsh onions stayed green and ready. Medieval gardening texts note their value specifically for this, not for size, not for flavor complexity, but for simply being there when nothing else was. Modern agriculture moved away from Welsh onions in favor of true onions, larger bulbs, more uniform, better suited to the single-harvest commercial model. The Welsh onion's greatest virtue, its persistence, was irrelevant to an industry that needed a crop it could plant, pull, and move on from. The irony is that the disposable model, grow once, harvest, discard, replant, requires far more labor and resources over time than the perennial model it replaced. Medieval farmers understood this intuitively. Salsify tastes like oysters. Not approximately, not with a bit of imagination. When properly cooked, the flavor compound breakdown, driven primarily by inulin converting under heat, produces something that genuinely approximates seafood. Food writers in the 18th century called it the vegetable oyster without irony. In medieval Europe, this was not a curiosity. It was a solution to a concrete problem. Religious dietary law prohibited meat and fish on Fridays, during Lent, and on a significant number of feast and fast days throughout the year, accounting for roughly a third of the calendar in devout households. Monastery garden records from the 15th century show salsify grown deliberately as a fish substitute during these periods. The flavor wasn't a quirk, it was the product's entire value proposition. Two varieties existed, white salsify and black salsify. Both have long, thin roots with tough skin that requires peeling, and both taste considerably better than they look, which is not a high bar to clear. Salsify's decline tracks almost exactly with the gradual relaxation of strict religious dietary observance in post-Reformation Europe. When the dietary restriction disappeared, so did the market for the solution. The vegetable didn't become worse. The problem it solved became less urgent. If salsify is the vegetable oyster, scorzonera is the vegetable that figured out long-term storage before anyone invented a good reason to need it, and then watched the world develop refrigeration instead. Black-skinned, white-fleshed, with a flavor milder and sweeter than salsify, hints of asparagus, a slight nuttiness, nothing aggressive. Scorzonera was straightforward to grow and remarkable to store. Harvested in autumn, buried in dry sand in a cool cellar, it remained edible until the following summer. 8 months of storage without any technology beyond a container and some sand. Monastery gardens favored it, not just for flavor during fasting periods, but because a vegetable with that storage life reduced the winter vulnerability that killed people. Medieval doctors prescribed scorzonera preparations for digestive complaints and as a general tonic. Its decline is simple. Global logistics made seasonal storage irrelevant. When you can fly green beans from Kenya in January, a vegetable whose main selling point is that it keeps until June becomes invisible to the supply chain. Scorzonera didn't lose a competition. The competition it was built for stopped happening. It grows well in deep, loose soil, takes patience, about 4 months from seed to harvest. The effort to reward ratio is, by contemporary standards, considered unfavorable. By medieval standards, it was a minor miracle. The name has nothing to do with maize. Corn salad gets its name from its habit of growing in grain fields. Europeans called all-grain corn long before maize arrived from the Americas, where it appears naturally after harvest and overwinters as a low rosette of tender, mild greens. Medieval farmers didn't cultivate it so much as notice it was already there and incorporate it into winter eating. The flavor is gentle and slightly nutty, with none of the bitterness common to many wild greens. The nutritional profile is notable, 3 times the omega-3 fatty acids of iceberg lettuce, with meaningful iron and vitamin C. This wasn't a famine food, it was a winter staple eaten because it was good. Its disappearance from the mainstream food supply is almost entirely logistical. Corn salad wilts within roughly 24 hours of harvest. For anyone growing their own, this is irrelevant. You pick it fresh and eat it. For an industry built around central distribution, cold storage, and a supply chain that measures transit time in days, a vegetable that wilts before it arrives is not a product. It simply doesn't exist as far as retail is concerned. You can still find it labeled as mosh in some specialty grocers at prices that suggest it's been promoted from forgotten medieval weed to artisan delicacy. The vegetable did not change. The price point did. Sea kale grows on coastal shingle, raw, salt-sprayed, essentially hostile ground, and produces edible shoots and leaves with what appears to be complete indifference to whether conditions are suitable. It is not a delicate plant. For medieval fishing communities with limited access to fresh produce through winter, sea kale offered something genuinely significant: vitamin C content that, by weight, substantially exceeds citrus fruit. In communities where scurvy was a real risk, a plant growing freely on nearby beaches and requiring nothing in the way of cultivation or maintenance was not taken for granted. Local knowledge about sea kale was practical knowledge about staying healthy. The young blanched shoots harvested in spring taste mild and sweet, compared most often to a gentle asparagus. The mature leaves cook like cabbage without the bitterness. It had a brief moment of fashionable cultivation in 18th century England before being forgotten again as wider food distribution improved. Sea kale's problem in the contemporary food system is entirely aesthetic. It doesn't photograph well, it doesn't stack neatly, it offers no obvious branding angle. In a food economy where visual appeal is a prerequisite for shelf space, sea kale is functionally invisible, despite being nutritious, freely available, and growing on beaches at this very moment.
The medlar requires a specific kind of patience that modern food culture has systematically eliminated. Fresh off the tree in autumn, the medlar is hard, brown, and completely inedible. It has an open base that exposes its seeds and an appearance that suggests something has gone wrong. Everything about it, to contemporary eyes trained to assess produce by visual freshness, reads as failure. What's actually required is bledding, a period of controlled softening, somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks, during which the fruit's chemistry transforms. The flesh goes from astringent and hard to soft, brown, and genuinely sweet, a flavor that medieval cookbooks describe and that modern food writers who've encountered it confirm as something close to spiced applesauce, tart, warm, complex. Medieval recipe manuscripts contain dozens of medlar preparations, tarts, jellies, wine, paste. Chaucer mentioned them. They appear in household accounts from across northern Europe. The fruit had legitimate enthusiasts, not people making the best of limited options, but people who actually liked it. The medlar's current absence from markets is almost entirely conceptual. A fruit that looks like it's failing when it's actually finishing doesn't survive contact with modern retail. The supply chain cannot distinguish between a medlar doing its job and a medlar that's simply spoiled. The crude nicknames it earned in medieval times, well documented, universally understood, not suitable for elaboration here, suggest that medieval people found humor in its appearance but kept growing it anyway, which perhaps is the correct response. Alexanders arrived in Britain with the Romans, who cultivated it as a useful herb throughout the empire. It naturalized so aggressively on British coastlines and roadways that by the medieval period, farmers in coastal regions had a free, self-replenishing supply of something with a flavor more complex and intense than celery, usable from stem to seed. The stems could be eaten raw or cooked. The leaves added depth to soups. The flowers appeared in salads. The seeds were ground as a spice, substituting for pepper when pepper was expensive, which in medieval Europe was frequently. Every part contributed something at different points in the growing season. Its displacement by celery is almost painfully straightforward. Celery was milder, easier to cultivate in neat rows, more predictable, and had a flavor profile that didn't startle anyone. It was the managed, domesticated version of something that Alexanders did better, but less cooperatively. The pointed irony is that Alexanders still grow wild on British coastlines, visibly, abundantly, and food writers who rediscover it invariably describe the flavor as exciting and complex. Those are exactly the qualities that caused it to be replaced by celery 400 years ago. We bred the intensity out of our food supply, and then, generations later, started paying for the privilege of finding it again. Chickweed received no royal patronage. No monastery garden dedicated rows to it. It never appeared in a court banquet or earned a mention in a noble household's kitchen accounts. It was simply everywhere, and people ate it. This small, sprawling plant with tiny white flowers appears in any disturbed soil, in any season above freezing, in virtually any conditions. Medieval people did not plant it, tend it, or harvest it with any ceremony. They picked it when other options were limited, and it was there, which in winter was most of the time. The vitamin C content is significant, considerably higher per gram than many cultivated greens available during winter months. During the hungry gap between winter stores running out and the first spring crops coming in, chickweed's quiet nutritional contribution wasn't trivial. It was reliable, available, and free. Its elimination from the contemporary diet is entirely collateral. The herbicides developed to protect grain crops in the 20th century killed chickweed efficiently and without discussion. Nobody made a decision that chickweed was nutritionally worthless. A blanket chemical solution to field weeds removed it along with everything else in the category, and the agricultural system moved on without noticing. It will grow in your garden if you let it. It is doing so right now in uncountable hedgerows and disturbed patches of soil across Europe. The question of whether that constitutes a comeback or a stubborn refusal to accept irrelevance is honestly open. Woad lived a double life for most of its history, and the food half of that life has been almost entirely forgotten. The plant is primarily known as the source of blue dye, the pigment that colored medieval textiles, that warriors applied to skin, that appeared in illuminated manuscripts. Before indigo from South Asia became available via established trade routes, woad was the only reliable source of blue dye in Europe. The processing was notoriously unpleasant. Fermentation-based extraction that generated an odor severe enough that Edward III issued royal orders restricting woad processing near towns and residences. This is a documented historical fact that requires no embellishment. What's less remembered is that young woad leaves, harvested before the dyeing compounds fully developed, are entirely edible. The flavor is mild, slightly peppery, similar to young mustard greens. Medieval farmers who grew woad for dye harvested the first leaves of the season for cooking and waited for the plant to mature before beginning dye production. The same crop used twice in sequence. The food use disappeared when the dye use disappeared, when indigo imports made woad uneconomical as a dye plant in the 17th century. Without the primary commercial use, cultivation ceased. Nobody specifically chose to stop eating woad leaves. The industry that incidentally produced them simply ended. Roman soldiers carried lovage seeds as campaign provisions. This is not culinary folklore. It's attested in enough sources to be treated as reliable. The idea of an army marching across Europe and planting herb seeds in its wake sounds like an odd logistical priority until you understand what lovage actually does. One stem can flavor a pot of soup that an entire bunch of celery couldn't approach. The taste is intense, deeply savory, celery and parsley as a base note, with something darker and more complex underneath. Medieval cooks used it liberally. Monastery garden records from the 13th century list it as a standard fixture. Recipe manuscripts reference it routinely, not as an exotic ingredient, but as a kitchen staple. The medicinal case was taken seriously too. Lovage contains volatile oils that genuinely aid digestion and act as a mild diuretic, properties that medieval herbalists documented and that modern analysis has confirmed, even if the medieval prescriptions were somewhat imprecise about dosage. A lovage plant, once established, lives for up to 20 years, grows over 6 feet tall, comes back vigorously each spring without any intervention. From a commercial horticulture perspective, a plant that lives for 2 decades in a fixed location and can't be replanted and sold is structurally incompatible with the business model. Lovage faded as international spice trade expanded and as milder herbs became fashionable. We didn't lose it because it stopped being useful. We lost interest in something intense and grew accustomed to something easier. Tansy is aggressive. There's no point softening that. The flavor profile, bitter, medicinal, sharply aromatic, comes from over 40 identified volatile compounds, with thujone as the dominant note. It is not a subtle herb. Medieval cooks used it anyway, and the evidence suggests they used it deliberately, not as a last resort. Easter tansy pudding is documented across multiple English recipe sources from the 14th and 15th centuries. Chopped leaves combined with eggs, cream, breadcrumbs, and sugar fried into a flat cake. Tansy-infused ale appeared at seasonal celebrations. Tansy-flavored cheeses in spring. Its presence in the festive culinary calendar wasn't incidental, it was structural. Beyond flavor, tansy served as a practical food preservative. The same compounds that give it intensity inhibit bacterial growth. In a kitchen without refrigeration, adding tansy to meat preparations or baked goods extended their safe consumption window. The flavor and the function were inseparable. The honest answer about its decline involves 2 things. Taste changed, and thujone in concentrated quantities is genuinely toxic. The second concern is real, though the gap between used in Easter pudding and dangerous is considerably wider than the complete abandonment of the plant implies. The pendulum swung from regular culinary use to categorical avoidance, which probably overcorrects. What medieval food culture had and modern food culture struggles with is tolerance for intensity. Tansy was not for everyday use. It was seasonal, specific, and powerful. That kind of ingredient requires a relationship with food that contemporary cooking has largely moved away from. This one is not about a forgotten vegetable. Everyone knows turnips. Turnips are in supermarkets, turnips appear in stews and root vegetable mixes and haven't gone anywhere. This isn't a story about rediscovering something obscure. This is a story about the top half of a vegetable we never stopped growing. Medieval cooks used turnip greens as a matter of routine, harvesting outer leaves throughout the growing season without disturbing the developing root below. The greens were added to soups, wilted as a side dish, and incorporated into the kind of long-simmered stews that formed the backbone of everyday medieval cooking. The peppery bitterness of the leaves was considered a flavor asset, not a problem to work around. The nutritional comparison is unflattering to the root. Turnip greens contain roughly 4 times the calcium, 3 times the vitamin A, and twice the protein of the root that sits below them. The part we eat is the less nutritious part. The part we discard was the point. Industrial agriculture treats the top as field waste. The root is the product, the trim is the trim. No one made a nutritional argument for discarding it. The decision was logistical, made by a processing system that had no mechanism for valuing what couldn't be packaged and shipped. This is the last entry, and it's deliberately the most straightforward. No obscure history, no medieval monks, just a vegetable growing in supermarket distribution chains right now, being systematically cut in half and called complete.
These 15 plants didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because the system that replaced medieval food production optimized for things they weren't good at. Visual consistency, long shelf life, scalable single harvests, national distribution. Those are legitimate goals. The food system built on them has, in measurable ways, reduced hunger and stabilized supply in ways that matter. But optimization is always optimization for something, and whatever you're not optimizing for, you lose. In this case, flavor complexity, nutritional variety, agricultural resilience, and 15 plants that quietly did their jobs for centuries before the job description changed without them. Some of them are still out there. Alexanders on British clifftops, chickweed in every garden that stopped using herbicide, sea kale on shingle beaches, fat hen returning to any patch of disturbed soil within weeks of being cleared. The plants didn't give up. We stopped recognizing them. A medieval monastery garden, small, labor-intensive, dependent on what could be grown rather than what could be ordered, probably offered more nutritional variety per square meter than most contemporary supermarket produce sections. That's either a reason to think differently about what we grow, or it's a mildly uncomfortable fact about iceberg lettuce. Either way, the ditch knows things we forgot to write down. If any of this stuck, the monks storing roots in sand to survive until June, the vegetable banned by royal decree for smelling too bad, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment with a food or an era you think history got wrong. And if you know someone who considers iceberg lettuce a vegetable, send this their way. As always, we'll see you in the past.